Good morning. Good morning. This morning I'm going to be reading Chapter 4 from The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung. But before I do that, I want to begin with, hopefully today we will have chat. Before I do that, I want to read once again an important paragraph from Chapter 5. The rupture between faith and knowledge is a symptom of the split consciousness, which is so characteristic of the mental disorder of our day. It is as if two different persons were making statements about the same thing, each from his own point of view, or as if one person in two different frames of mind were sketching a picture of his experience. If for person we substitute modern society, it is evident that the latter is suffering from a mental dissociation, i.e., a neurotic disturbance. In view of this, it does not help matters at all if one party pulls obstinately to the right and the other to the left. This is what happens in every neurotic psyche, to its own deep distress, and it is just this distress that brings the patient to the doctor. As I stated above in all brevity, while not neglecting to mention certain practical details whose omission might have perplexed the reader, the doctor has to establish a relationship with both halves of his patient's personality, because only from them both, and not merely from one half, with the suppression of the other, can he put together a whole and complete man. Obviously, you can't put together a whole and complete society either. Okay, so that was a brief reading from Chapter 5. Now, yesterday I wasn't able to get the chat going, so I'm going to just test it now. I hope if you're watching this, you have been able to see the chat, and that will mean that we will be able to answer, not the royal we, but I'll be able to respond to comments and questions. And this is going to be a long reading. This is 22 pages long in this little book. So I'm reading from The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung, Chapter 4. The title of the chapter is The Individual's Understanding of Himself. It is astounding that man, the instigator, inventor, and vehicle of all these developments, the originator of all judgments and decisions, and the planner of the future, must make himself such a quantité négligeable. I'll read it in English. Must make himself such a negligible quantity. The contradiction, the paradoxical evaluation of humanity by man himself, is in truth a matter for wonder, and one can only explain it as springing from an extraordinary uncertainty of judgment. In other words, man is an enigma to himself. Thank you, Martin, for testing the chat. In other words, man is an enigma to himself. This is understandable, seeing that he lacks the means of comparison necessary for self-knowledge. He knows how to distinguish himself from the other animals in point of anatomy and physiology, but as a conscious, reflecting being, gifted with speech, he lacks all criteria for self-judgment. He is on this planet a unique phenomenon which he cannot compare with anything else. The possibility of comparison, and hence the self-knowledge, would arise only if he could establish relations with quasi-human mammals inhabiting other stars. Until then, man must continue to resemble a hermit who knows that in respect of comparative anatomy he has affinities with the anthropoids, but to judge by appearances is extraordinarily different from his cousins in respect to his psyche. It is just in this most important characteristic of his species that he cannot know himself and therefore remains a mystery to himself. The differences of degree within his own species are of little significance compared with the possibilities of self-knowledge, which would be occasioned by an encounter with a creature of similar structure but different origin. Our psyche, which is primarily responsible for all the historical changes wrought by the hand of man on the face of this planet, remains an insoluble puzzle and an incomprehensible wonder. An object of abiding perplexity, a feature it shares with all nature's secrets. In regard to the latter, we still have hope of making more discoveries and finding answers to the most difficult questions. But in regard to the psyche and psychology, there seems to be a curious hesitancy. Not only is it the youngest of the empirical sciences, but it has great difficulty in getting anywhere near its proper object. In the same way that our misconception of the solar system had to be freed from prejudice by Copernicus, the most strenuous efforts of a well-nigh revolutionary nature were needed to free psychology, first from the spell of mythological ideas, and then from the prejudice that the psyche is, on the one hand, a mere epiphenomenon of a biochemical process in the brain, or, on the other hand, a wholly unapproachable and recondite matter. The connection with the brain does not in itself prove that the psyche is an epiphenomenon, a secondary function casually dependent on biochemical processes. Nevertheless, we know only too well how much the psychic function can be disturbed by verifiable processes in the brain, and this fact is so impressive that the subsidiary nature of the psyche seems an almost unavoidable inference. The phenomenon of parapsychology, however, warn us to be careful, for they point to a relativization of space and time through psychic factors which cast doubt on our naive and over-hasty explanations of the parallels between the psychic and the physical. For the sake of this explanation, people deny the findings of parapsychology. For the sake of this explanation, people deny the findings of parapsychology outright, either for philosophical reasons or from intellectual laziness. This can hardly be considered a scientifically responsible attitude, even though it is a popular way out of a quite extraordinary intellectual difficulty. To assess the psychic phenomenon, we have to take account of all other phenomena that come with it, and accordingly we can no longer practice any psychology that ignores the existence of the unconscious or of parapsychology. The structure and physiology of the brain furnish no explanation of the psychic process. The psyche has a peculiar nature which cannot be reduced to anything else. Like physiology, it represents a relatively self-contained field of experience to which we must attribute a quite special importance because it holds within itself one of the two indispensable conditions for existence as such, namely the phenomenon of consciousness. Without consciousness, there would, practically speaking, be no world, for the world exists as such only insofar as it is consciously reflected and consciously expressed by the psyche. Consciousness is the precondition of being. He italicizes this, so I'll say it again. Consciousness is a precondition of being. Thus the psyche is endowed with the dignity of a cosmic principle, which philosophically and in fact gives it a position co-equal with the principle of physical being. The carrier of this consciousness is the individual, who does not produce the psyche on his own volition, but is, on the contrary, preformed by it and nourished by the gradual awakening of consciousness during childhood. If the psyche must be granted an overriding empirical importance, so also must the individual, who is the only immediate manifestation of the psyche. This fact must be expressly emphasized for two reasons. Firstly, the individual psyche, just because of its individuality, is an exception to the statistical rule and is, therefore, robbed of one of its main characteristics when subjected to the leveling influence of statistical evaluation. Secondly, the churches grant it validity only insofar as it is. Secondly, the churches granted validity only insofar as it acknowledges their dogmas. In other words, when it surrenders to a collective category. In both cases, the will to individuality is regarded as egotistic obstinacy. In both cases, the will to individuality is regarded as egotistic obstinacy. Science devalues it as subjectivism, and the churches condemn it morally as heresy and spiritual pride. As to the latter charge, it should not be forgotten that, unlike other religions, Christianity holds at its core a symbol which has for its content the individual way of life of a man, the Son of Man, and that it even regards this individuation process as the incarnation and revelation of God himself. Hence, the development of the self acquires a significance whose full implications have hardly begun to be appreciated, because too much attention to externals blocks the way to immediate inner experience. Were not the autonomy of the individual the secret longing of many people, this hard-pressed phenomenon would scarcely be able to survive the collective suppression, either morally or spiritually. Yes, I'm reading from the Undiscovered Self. Okay. Just repeat that. I'll reread the last sentence. Were not the autonomy of the individual the secret longing of many people, this hard-pressed phenomenon would scarcely be able to survive the collective suppression, either morally or spiritually. All these obstacles make it more difficult to arrive at a correct appreciation of the human psyche, but they count for very little beside one other remarkable fact that deserves mentioning. This is the common psychiatric experience that the devaluation of the psyche and other resistances to psychological enlightenment are based in large measure on fear, on panic fear of the discoveries that might be made in the realm of the unconscious. These fears are found not only among persons who are frightened by the picture Freud painted of the unconscious. These fears are not found only among persons who are frightened by the picture Freud painted of the unconscious. They also troubled the originator of psychoanalysis himself, who confessed to me that it was necessary to make a dogma of his sexual theory because this was the sole bulwark of reason against a possible outburst of the black flood of occultism. In these words, Freud was expressing his conviction that the unconscious still harbored many things that might lend themselves to occult interpretation, as is in fact the case. These archaic vestiges, or archetypal forms grounded on the instincts and giving expression to them, have a numinous quality that sometimes arouses fear. They are ineradicable, for they represent the ultimate foundations of the psyche itself. They cannot be grasped intellectually, and when one has destroyed one manifestation of them, they reappear in altered form. It is this fear of the unconscious psyche which not only impedes self-knowledge, but is the gravest obstacle to a wider understanding and knowledge of psychology. Often the fear is so great that one dares not admit it even to oneself. Here is a question that every religious person should consider very seriously. He might get an illuminating answer. A scientifically oriented psychology is bound to proceed abstractly. That is, it removes itself just sufficiently far from its object not to lose sight of it altogether. That is why the findings of laboratory psychology are, for all practical purposes, only so remarkably unenlightening and devoid of interest. The more the individual object dominates the field of vision, the more practical, detailed, and alive will be the knowledge derived from it. This means that the objects of investigation, too, become more and more complicated, and the uncertainty of individual factors increases proportionally to their number, thus increasing the possibility of error. Understandably enough, academic psychology is scared of this risk and prefers to avoid complex impunity. It has full freedom in the choice of questions it will put to nature. I'm reading from The Undiscovered Self by C.G. Jung, and I'm on page 51 in chapter 4. Medical psychology is very far from being in this more or less enviable position. Here the object puts the question and not the experimenter. The doctor is confronted with facts which are not of his choosing, and which he probably never would choose if he were a free agent. It is the sickness or the patient that puts the crucial questions. In other words, nature experiments with the doctor in expecting an answer from him. The unique... In other words, nature experiments with the doctor in expecting an answer from him. The uniqueness of the individual and of his situation stares the doctor in the face and demands an answer. His duty as a physician forces him to cope with a situation swarming with uncertainty factors. At first, he will apply principles based on general experience, but he will soon realize that principles of this kind do not adequately express the facts and fail to meet the nature of the case. The deeper his understanding penetrates, the more the general principles lose their meaning. But these principles are the foundation of objective knowledge and the yardstick by which it is measured. With the growth of what both patient and doctor feel to be understanding, the situation becomes increasingly subjectivized. What was an advantage to begin with threatens to turn into a dangerous disadvantage. Subjectivism, in technical terms transference and countertransference, creates isolation from the environment, a social limitation which neither party wishes for, but which invariably sets in when understanding predominates and is no longer balanced by knowledge. As understanding deepens, the further removed it becomes from knowledge. An ideal understanding would ultimately result in each party's unthinkingly going along with the other's experience, a state of uncritical passivity coupled with the most complete subjectivity and lack of social responsibility. Understanding carried to such lengths is in any case impossible, for it would require the virtual identification of two different individuals. Sooner or later, the relationship reaches a point where one partner feels he is being forced to sacrifice his own individuality so that it may be assimilated by that of the other. This inevitable consequence breaks the understanding, for understanding presupposes the integral preservation of the individuality of both partners. It is therefore advisable to carry understanding only to the point where the balance between understanding and knowledge is reached, for understanding at all costs is injurious to both parties. For understanding at all costs is injurious to both partners. This problem arises whenever complex individual situations have to be known and understood. It is the specific task of psychology to provide just this knowledge and understanding. It would also be the task of the confessor, zealous in the cure of souls, were it not that his office inevitably obliges him to apply the yardstick of his denominational bias at the critical point. At the critical moment. As a result, the individual's right to exist as such is cut short by a collective prejudice and often curtailed in the most sensitive area. The only time this does not happen is when the religious symbol, for instance, the model life of Christ, is understood correctly and felt by the individual to be adequate. How far this is the case today, I would prefer to leave to the judgment of others. At all events, the doctor very often has to treat patients to whom denominational limitations mean little or nothing. His profession therefore compels him to have as few preconceptions as possible. Similarly, while respecting metaphysical, i.e., non-verifiable, convictions and assertions, he will take care not to credit them with universal validity. This caution is called for because individual traits of personality ought not to be twisted out of shape by arbitrary interventions from outside. The doctor must leave this to the environmental influences, to the person's own inner development, and, in the widest sense, to fate with its wise and unwise decrees. Many people will perhaps find this heightened caution exaggerated. In view of the fact, however, that there is in any case such a multitude of reciprocal influences at work in the dialectical process between two individuals, even if this process is conducted with the most tactful reserve, the responsible doctor will refrain from adding unnecessarily to the collective factors to which his patient has already succumbed. Moreover, he knows very well that the preaching of even the worthiest precepts only provokes the patient into open hostility or a secret resistance, and thus needlessly endangers the aim of the treatment. The psychic situation of the individual is so menaced nowadays by advertisements, propaganda, and other more or less well-meant advice and suggestions, that for once in his life the patient might be offered a relationship that does not repeat the nauseating "you should," "you must," and similar confessions of impotence. Against the onslaught from outside, no less than against its repercussions in the psyche of the individual, the doctor sees himself obliged to play the role of counsel for the defense. Fear that anarchic instincts will thereby be let loose is a possibility that is greatly exaggerated, seeing that obvious safeguards exist within and without. Above all, there is the natural cowardice of most men to be reckoned with, not to mention morality, good taste, and last but not least, the penal code. This fear is nothing compared with the enormous effort it usually costs people to help the first stirrings of individuality into consciousness, let alone put them into effect. And where these individual impulses have broken through too impetuously and unthinkingly, the doctor must protect them from the patient's own clumsy recourse to short-sightedness, ruthlessness, and cynicism. As the dialectic discussion proceeds, a point is reached where an evaluation of these individual impulses becomes necessary. By that time, the patient should have acquired enough certainty of judgment to enable him to act on his own insight and decision, and not from the mere wish to copy convention, even if he happens to agree with collective opinion. Unless he stands firmly on his own feet, the so-called objective values profit him nothing, since they then only serve as a substitute for character, and so help to suppress his individuality. Naturally, society has an indisputable right to protect itself against errant subjectivisms, but insofar as society itself is composed of de-individualized persons, it is completely at the mercy of ruthless individualists. Let it band together into groups and organizations as much as it likes. It is just this banding together and the resultant extinction of individual personality that makes it succumb so readily to a dictator. A million zeros joined together do not, unfortunately, add up to one. Ultimately, everything depends on the equality of the individual, but the fatally short-sighted habit of our age is to think only in terms of large numbers and mass organizations, though one would think that the world had seen more than enough of what a well-disciplined mob can do in the hands of a single madman. Unfortunately, this realization does not seem to have penetrated very far, and our blindness in this respect is extremely dangerous. People go on blithely organizing and believing in the sovereign remedy of mass action without the least consciousness of the fact that the most powerful organizations can be maintained only by the greatest ruthlessness of their leaders and the cheapest of slogans. Curiously enough, the churches too want to avail themselves of mass action in order to cast out the devil with Beelzebub. The very churches whose care is the salvation of the individual soul, they too do not appear to have heard anything of the elementary axiom of mass psychology, that the individual becomes morally and spiritually inferior in the mass, and for this reason they do not burden themselves overmuch with their real task of helping the individual to achieve a metanoia, or rebirth of the spirit, Deo Concedente. Just read that sentence once again. referring to the churches, they too do not appear to have heard anything of the elementary axiom of mass psychology, that the individual becomes morally and spiritually inferior in the mass. And for this reason, they do not burden themselves overmuch with their real task of helping the individual to achieve a metanoia, or rebirth of the spirit, Deo Concedente. It is unfortunately only too clear that if the individual is not truly regenerated in spirit, society cannot be either, for society is the sum total of individuals in need of redemption. I can therefore see it only as a delusion when the churches try, as they apparently do, to rope the individual into a social organization and reduce him to a condition of diminished responsibility, instead of raising him out of the torpid, mindless mass and making clear to him that he is the one important factor, and that the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul. It is true that mass meetings parade such ideas before him and seek to impress them on him by dint of mass suggestion, with the unedifying result that when the intoxication has worn off, the mass man promptly succumbs to another, even more obvious and still louder slogan: his individual relation to God would be an effective shield against these pernicious influences. Did Christ ever call his disciples? Did Christ ever call his disciples to him at a mass meeting? Did the feeding of the 5,000 bring him any followers who did not afterwards cry, "Crucify him," with the rest, when even the rock named Peter showed signs of wavering? And are not Jesus and Paul prototypes of those who, trusting their inner experience, have gone their own individual ways, disregarding public opinion? This argument should certainly not cause us to overlook the reality of the situation confronting the church. When the church tries to give shape to the amorphous mass by uniting individuals into a community of believers with the help of suggestion, and tries to hold such an organization together, it is not only performing a great social service, but it also secures for the individual the inestimable boon of a meaningful life form. These, however, are gifts which as a rule confirm certain tendencies and do not change them. As experience unfortunately shows, the inner man remains unchanged, however much community he has. His environment cannot give him as a gift that which he can win for himself only with effort and suffering. On the contrary, a favorable environment merely strengthens the dangerous tendency to expect everything to originate from outside, even that metamorphosis which external reality cannot provide, namely a deep-seated change of the inner man, which is all the more urgent in view of the mass phenomena of today and the still greater problems of the increase of population looming up in the future. It is time we asked ourselves exactly what we are lumping together in mass organization. It is time we asked ourselves exactly what it is we are lumping together in mass organizations and what constitutes the nature of the individual human being, i.e., the real man and not the statistical man. This is hardly possible except through a new process of self-nourishment. I'll just rest my eyes a minute by looking at some of your comments. Martin says, I think this is why we are seeing a divide between intuitive feelers and the majority of the sensor population, when it comes to social justice issues, perhaps shadow magician manipulation. And Sean says, how else can one dispel illusions except by looking at them directly without protecting them? Thomas says, I watched a video, Chris Hedges on the cult of Trump, which makes a convincing 20-minute argument using Jim Jones and others, a single knob in the hands of one madman from the undiscovered self. And Miles says, a good wife gives her husband the leeway to change his path, but keeps the pressure on for results, and husband appreciates her wisdom. Very good, Miles. And vice versa, but men don't have as much Sophia. Very good. Let me see if I can read Miles's comment once more without laughing. A good wife gives her husband the leeway to change his path, but keeps the pressure on for results, and the husband appreciates her wisdom, and vice versa. But men don't have as much Sophia, meaning wisdom. Caleb says, what is it that we lump together under the flag of religion? And let me just comment on that, Caleb. I think what we lump together under the flag of religion is our fear of our unconscious and quote-unquote chaos. This is why Jordan Peterson used the term chaos in the name of his most recent book. Thomas says, religious scholar Reza Aslan makes a similar claim. It would probably not be the first time a cult leader became a leader in America, but it might be the first time he led so many, i.e. evangelicals. Right. Okay, let me see if I can go back to this. Okay, I'm on page 58. I'm going to page 67. I hope to finish that in about 1 hour at the most. All mass movements, as one might expect, slip with the greatest ease down an inclined plane represented by large numbers. Where the many are, there is security. What the many believe must, of course, be true. What the many want must be worth striving for and necessary, and therefore good. In the clamor of the many there lies the power to snatch wish fulfillments by force. Sweetest of all, however, is that gentle and painless slipping back into the kingdom of childhood, into the paradise of parental care, into happy-go-luckiness and irresponsibility. All the thinking and looking after are done from the top. To all questions there is an answer, and for all needs the necessary provision is made. The infantile dream state of the mass man is so unrealistic that he never thinks to ask who is paying for this paradise. The balancing of accounts is left to a higher political or social authority, which welcomes the task, for its power is thereby increased, and the more power it has, the weaker and more helpless the individual becomes. Or in the case of Donald Trump, I don't have to worry about the national debt because it'll be paid for after I'm gone. By the way, Thomas, Reza Aslan is an excellent writer, and I can urge everyone who is watching this video to read some of his work. Let's see. I was just trying to think of one of his books. I have several of his books. Well, it'll come to me. It's something like Christ the Revolutionary or something like that. Anyway. So, page 58. Where social conditions of this type develop on a large scale, the road to tyranny lies open, and the freedom of the individual turns into spiritual and physical slavery. Since every tyranny is ipso facto immoral and ruthless, it has much more freedom in the choice of its methods than an institution which still takes account of the individual. Should such an institution come into conflict with the organized state, it is soon made aware of the very real disadvantage of its morality and therefore feels compelled to avail itself of the same methods as its opponent. In this way, the evil spreads almost of necessity, even when direct infection might be avoided. The danger of infection is greater when the danger of infection is greater where decisive importance is attached to large numbers and statistical values, as is everywhere the case in our Western world. The suffocating power of the masses is paraded before our eyes. The suffocating power of the masses is paraded before our eyes in one form or another every day in the newspaper, and the insignificance of the individual is rubbed into him so thoroughly that he loses all hope of making himself heard. The outworn ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité help him not at all, as he can direct this appeal only to his executioners, the spokesmen of the masses. Righto. Resistance to the organized mass can be effected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself. I say again, it is italicized in the book. Resistance to the organized mass can be effected only by the man who is as well organized in his individuality as the mass itself. I fully realize that this proposition must sound well near unintelligible to the man of today. The helpful medieval view that man is a microcosm, a reflection of the great cosmos in miniature, has long since dropped away from him, although the very existence of his world-embracing and world-conditioning psyche might have taught him better. Not only is the image of the macrocosm imprinted upon him as a psychic being, but he also creates this image for himself on ever-widening scale. He bears this cosmic correspondence within him by virtue of his reflecting consciousness. On the one hand, and on the other, thanks to the heredity, archetypal nature of his instincts, which bind him to his environment. But his instincts not only attach him to the macrocosm, they also, in a sense, tear him apart, because his desires pull him in different directions. In this way, he falls into continual conflict with himself, and only very rarely succeeds in giving his life an undivided goal, for which, as a rule, he must pay very dearly by repressing other sides of his nature. One often has to ask oneself in such cases whether this kind of one-sidedness is worth forcing at all, seeing that the natural state of the human psyche consists in a certain jostling together of its components and in the contradictoriness of their behavior, that is, in a certain degree of dissociation. Buddhism calls it attachment Buddhism calls it attachment to the 10,000 things. Such a condition cries out for order and synthesis. Just as the chaotic movements of the crowd, all ending in mutual frustration, are impelled in a definite direction by a dictatorial will, so the individual in his dissociated state needs a directing and ordering principle. Ego consciousness would like to let its own will play this role, but overlooks the existence of powerful unconscious factors which thwart its intentions. Let me try that sentence once again. Ego consciousness would like to let its own will play this role, but overlooks the existence of powerful unconscious factors which thwart its intentions. If it wants to reach the goal of synthesis, it must first get to know the nature of these factors. It must experience them, or else it must possess a numinous symbol that expresses them and conduces to synthesis. A religious symbol that comprehends and visibly represents what is seeking expression in modern man could probably do this, but our conception of the Christian symbol to date has certainly not been able to do so. On the contrary, that frightful world split runs right through the domains of the Christian white man, and our Christian outlook on life has proved powerless to prevent the recrudescence of an archaic social order like communism. This is not to say that Christianity is finished. I am, on the contrary, convinced that it is not Christianity, but our conception and interpretation of it that has become antiquated in the face of the present world situation. The Christian symbol is a living thing that carries in itself the seeds of further development. It can go on developing. It depends only on us whether we can make up our minds to meditate again and more thoroughly on the Christian premises. This requires a very different attitude towards the individual, towards the microcosm of the self, from the one we have had hitherto. That is why nobody knows what ways of approach are open to man, what inner experiences he can still pass through, and what psychic facts underlie the religious myth. Over this hangs so universal a darkness that no one can see why he should be interested, or to what end he could commit himself. Before this problem, we can stand helpless. Or let me reread that. Before this problem, we stand helpless. I'll reread the entire sentence. That is why nobody knows what ways of approach are open to man, what inner experiences he can still pass through, and what psychic facts underlie the religious myth. Over this hangs so universal a darkness that no one can see why he should be interested, or to what end he could commit himself. Before this problem, we stand helpless. Okay, I'll look again here. Mr. Caleb says, what is it that we lump together under the flag of religion? I think Dr. Jung would probably say that we lump together the irrational or chaos, if we put it in Dr. Peterson's way, and then religion has dogma to protect you from that chaos. The problem is that it stops your development. Thomas says, religious scholar. Let's see. Oh, okay, I already read that. I'm sorry. Sean says, do you think people could ever admit this statement, quote, I do not know the thing I am, and therefore do not know what I am doing, where I am, or how to look upon the world or on myself? Sean, I think that and I'm not directly experienced with Alcoholics Anonymous, but I have read about it and read about 12-step programs. And I think that this is exactly the admission, or very similar to the admission that they do admit to in the process. Someone else on this chat could tell me I'm wrong and tell me how it differs from what you've said. Thomas says, Sean, I sort of feel that way every day when I wake up, making up answers as I go through the day, hoping they're aligned with reality. Though I don't go to sleep feeling I've found a complete answer. I think that's fair enough. I think all of us of an age probably feel that way. And Thomas observed yesterday that there's a guiding hand that guides all of us, and this is what Dr. Jung referred to as the self. And certainly I feel that guiding hand, because what I am doing every day in my work in conjunction with this YouTube channel is I am following the direction of my unconscious drive. And sometimes I'm not very effective, but sometimes I am. Miles says, if you are in a brick and mortar church, ask yourself if they are restraining your individuation. Yeah, fair enough question. I don't think most people, and certainly it never occurred to me about these issues of individuation until years after I started studying Dr. Jung. In fact, it's only in about the last 3 years that I really understood that he was saying anything that was useful in terms of modern religion. Now I think that the subsidiary writing from his later works has started to reflect that, and certainly Edward Edinger passed that baton to us in his work in the last 30 years of the 20th century. And the problem is that neither I nor most people ever found any of Edinger's work until recently. I think it was well known among so-called Jungians, but I don't think it was well known among most people that are interested in psychology. And for example, my daughter majored in psychology in college, and I think she didn't study Jungian psychology at all. I do remember looking at her freshman psychology book, and in that there were about 2 paragraphs about there were 2 paragraphs about Dr. Jung. Martin says, I think churches are full of censor-type personality, and so it's more about community and a more belief in the word in a concrete fashion, not much connection to other in an intuitive capacity. Yeah, I don't think that, most pastors even understand that they're doing anything with respect to psychology. They think they're doing things in terms of theology. And, you can listen to Paul Vanderklay, who I respect very much because he's one of the few pastors I know, and I do know a few, who have gotten interested in psychology and they've gone and started to study it. But even when you hear Pastor Vanderklay speak about the word and religious principles, he's always entirely on the logos side, and talking about, well, this guy said this in the 6th century, and this guy said this in the 12th century. And, the problem is that all those books, and that black one, which is the most popular book in the world, those books are just heavy book doorstops until you put life in them. And when you put life in them, by definition, you put a certain amount of chaos in them. But we need a balance between the two. Otherwise, you have a very rigid society that doesn't really advance. And so you can simply look to some of the other religions. I won't be specific here, but some of the other religions that are very emphatic about their holy books, and you see how they've developed. Sean says, we might be seeing a projection of anger that's formed by the lack of escape in ego dynamics. The unconsciousness can't be forever suppressed, even if we collectively try to become more aware. The unconscious can't be suppressed. It's coming up, and it's coming up pretty fast now. And we're about to see how it plays out and what crises it causes in our society in the United States. That will be coming over the next couple of months, I suppose, and maybe over the coming year. Martin says, not that the space cannot be transformative, in reference to church and censor community. Yes, I think that the space is transformative, and certainly when I go to the Naval Academy Chapel, which I often do when I'm feeling distress, I find it very calming and very helpful to me, and I do have quote unquote religious experiences there. Very rarely in services, though, and more from my own meditative practice than from services involving Christianity of whatever type. Caleb says, 12-step programs encourage an honest inventory of the individual's behavior and personality traits to overcome the ego's ability to warp subjective reality. It's a way to tell the true from the false. Absolutely, I think that that's something that we probably all need, and it's only when we get in real trouble that we get that help in the form of 12-step programs. Okay, let's see if I can find where I was again. All right, page 62. I have 5 pages left in this reading. This is not surprising. Let's see. Because the next paragraph begins with, this is not surprising. I think I better reread this sentence yet once more. There are a couple of sentences. And Dr. Jung is talking about how religion needs to adjust, and he says, this requires a very different attitude toward the individual, towards the microcosm of the self, from the one we have had hitherto. That is why nobody knows what ways of approach are open to man, what inner experiences he can still pass through, and what psychic facts underlie the religious myth. Over this hangs so universal a darkness that no one can see what he should be that no one can see why he should be interested, or to what end he could commit himself. Before this problem, we stand helpless. This is not surprising, since practically all very ironic sentence here. This is not surprising, since practically all the trump cards are in the hands of our opponents. They can appeal to the big battalions and their crushing power. Politics, science, and technology stand ranged on their side. The imposing arguments of science represent the highest degree of intellectual certainty yet achieved by the mind of man. So at least it seems to the man of today, who has received hundredfold enlightenment concerning the backwardness and darkness of past ages and their superstitions, that his teachers have themselves gone seriously astray by making false comparisons between incommensurable factors never enters his head. All the more so as the intellectual elite to whom he puts his questions are almost unanimously agreed that what science regards as impossible today was impossible at all other times as well. Above all, the facts of faith, which might give him the chance of an extra-mundane standpoint, are treated in the same context as the facts of science. Thus, when the individual questions the churches and their spokesmen, to whom is entrusted the cure of souls, he is informed that membership in a creed, a decidedly worldly institution, is more or less de rigueur for religious belief, that the facts of faith which have become questionable for him were concrete historical events, that certain ritual actions produce miraculous effects, and that the sufferings of Christ have vicariously saved him from sin and its consequences, i.e., eternal damnation. If, with the limited means at his disposal, he begins to reflect on these things, he will have to confess that he does not understand them at all, and that only two possibilities are open to him: either to believe implicitly, or to reject such statements because they are flatly incomprehensible. Whereas the man of today can easily think about and understand all the truths dished out to him by the state, his understanding of religion is made considerably more difficult owing to the lack of explanations. Do you understand what you are reading? And he said, How can I, unless someone guides me? Acts 8:30. If, despite this, he has still not discarded all his religious convictions, this is because the religious impulse rests on an instinctive basis and therefore a specifically human function. You can take away a man's gods, but only to give him others in return. The leaders of the mass state cannot avoid being deified, and wherever crudities of this kind have not yet been put over by force, obsessive factors arise in their stead, charged with demonic energy. For instance, money, work, political influence, and so forth. When any natural human function gets lost, i.e., is denied conscious and intentional expression, a general disturbance results. Hence, it is quite natural that the triumph of the goddess of reason, a general neuroticizing of modern man, should set in. Hence, it is quite natural that the triumph of the goddess of reason, a general neuroticizing of modern man, should set in, a dissociation of personality analogous to the splitting of the world today by the Iron Curtain. Except today it's by the red state, blue state duality. This boundary line bristling with barbed wire runs through the psyche of modern man, no matter on which side he lives. And just as the typical neurotic is unconscious of his shadow side, so the normal individual, like the neurotic, sees his shadow in this neighbor or in the man beyond the great divide. It has even become a political and social duty to apostrophize the capitalism of one and the communism of the other as the very devil, so as to fascinate the outward eye and prevent it from looking at the individual life within. But just as the neurotic, despite unconsciousness of his other side, has a dim premonition that all is not well with his psychic economy, so Western man has developed an instinctive interest in his psyche and in psychology. Now, I'll just mention that this evening in the reading group session, I intend to discuss further the devil's trick as it relates to society. And I hope you'll be here with me starting at 8 p.m. Eastern Time to throw popcorn or whatever, and let's talk about the devil's trick and how it's being played on all of us, regardless of our political position. Page 64. Thus it is that the doctor is summoned willy-nilly to appear on the world stage, and questions are addressed to him which primarily concern the most intimate and hidden life of the individual, but which in the last analysis are the direct effects of the zeitgeist. Because of its personal symptomology, this material is usually considered to be neurotic, and rightly so, since it is made up of the infantile fantasies, which ill accord with the contents of an adult psyche, and are therefore repressed by our moral judgment, insofar as they reach consciousness at all. Most fantasies of this kind do not, in the nature of things, come to consciousness in infantile form, and it is very improbable, to say the least of it, that they were ever conscious and were consciously repressed. Rather, they seem to have been present always, or at any rate, to have arisen unconsciously and to have persisted in this state until the psychologist's intervention enabled them to cross the threshold of consciousness. The activation of unconscious fantasies is a process that occurs when consciousness finds itself in a critical situation. Were that not so, the fantasies would be produced normally and would then be followed by the usual neurotic disturbance. In reality, fantasies of this kind belong to the world of childhood and give rise to disturbances only when prematurely strengthened by abnormal conditions in the conscious life. This is particularly likely to happen when unfavorable influences emanate from the parents, poisoning the atmosphere and producing conflicts which upset the psychic balance of the child. When a neurosis breaks out in an adult, the fantasy world of childhood reappears, and one is attempted to explain the onset of the neurosis causally, as due to the presence of infantile fantasies. But that does not explain why the fantasies did not develop any pathological effects during the interim period. These effects develop only when the individual comes up against a situation which he cannot overcome by conscious means. The resultant standstill in the development of personality opens a sluice of infantile fantasies, which, of course, are latent in everybody but do not display any activity so long as the conscious personality can continue on its way unimpeded. When the fantasies reach a certain level of intensity, they begin to break through into consciousness and create a conflict situation that becomes perceptible to the patient himself, splitting him into two personalities with different characters. The dissociation, however, had been prepared long before in the unconscious, when the energy flowing off from consciousness, because unused, strengthened the negative qualities of the unconscious personality, and particularly its infantile traits. Since the normal fantasies of a child are nothing other at bottom than the imagination born of the instinctive impulses, and may thus be regarded as preliminary exercises in the use of future conscious activities, it follows that the fantasies of the neurotic, even though pathologically altered and perhaps perverted by the regression of energy, contain a core of normal instinct, the hallmark of which is adaptedness. A neurotic illness always implies an unadapted alteration and distortion of normal dynamisms and of the imagination proper to them. Instincts, however, are highly conservative and of extreme antiquity as regards both dynamism and their form. Their form, when represented to the mind, appears as an image which expresses the nature of the instinctive impulse, and concretely like a picture. If we could look into the psyche of the yucca moth, for instance, we would find in it a pattern of ideas, of a numinous or fascinating character, which not only compel the moth to carry out its fertilizing activity on the yucca plant, but help it to recognize the total situation. Instinct is anything but a blind and indefinite impulse, since it proves to be attuned and adapted to a definite external situation. This latter circumstance gives it its specific and irreducible form, just as instinct is original and hereditary. So too its form is old age, that is to say, archetypal. Oh, I misread that. I'm getting older, so I think of old age, but it is the opposite. So here, just as instinct is original and hereditary, so too its form is age-old, that is to say, archetypal. It is even older and more conservative than the body's form. These biological considerations naturally apply also to Homo sapiens, who still remains within the framework of general biology, despite the possession of consciousness, will, and reason. The fact that our conscious activity is rooted in instinct and derives from it its dynamism, as well as the basic features of its ideational forms, has the same significance for human psychology as for all other members of the animal kingdom. Human knowledge consists essentially in the constant adaptation of the primordial patterns of ideas that were given us a priori. These need certain modifications because in their original form they are suited to an archaic mode of life, but not to the demands of a specifically differentiated environment. If the flow of instinctive dynamism into our life is to be maintained, as is absolutely necessary for our existence, then it is imperative that we remold those archetypal forms into ideas which are adequate to the challenge of the present. Let me reread that. If the flow of instinctive dynamism into our life is to be maintained, as is absolutely necessary for our existence, then it is imperative that we remold these archetypal forms into ideas which are adequate to the challenge of the present. You think? Okay, so that's the end of chapter 5. I'll come back here and take... Let's see. Thomas has reminded me the name of the book that I was thinking of Aslan, Reza Aslan's, is Zealot. It's an excellent book. And God, A Human History is right up there with Armstrong's The History of God. Okay, so Sean had said, does one need to be determined to see, or will the universe find a way to illuminate the world? The universe is going to do what the universe will do. As Dr. Jung observed, Mother Nature keeps presenting herself, and it's man that has to differentiate and figure out what she's doing, but she very often is a corrective. Thomas says, the idea of a cult political leader ties into Jung's thoughts of mass man, methinks, the longing for a glorious past, that gentle and painless slipping back into the kingdom of childhood. Absolutely. Aslan is a very perceptive writer on religion. Absolutely. Miles says, the question to challenge pastors is, are you today's Pharisee? Have you added a yeast to the message? And are you willing to change? Fair question. The question is, what do you want them to change to? Be careful what you wish for. And I'm not sure we have the answer to that. I really am not sure. I'm going to discuss it with Paul Vanderklay in January, but I'm looking forward to that discussion, and it will be a private discussion to begin with. Sean says that resonates with some of the Jung and Nietzsche I've read lately. Thomas, then he's referring to Zealot as one of Aslan's books. God, A Human History is right up there with Armstrong's The History of God. Sean says, I'll have to check out Reza Aslan. Yes, you will. Martin, this is what I have experienced. I feel the psyche will automatically try to fight the dragon, both personal and collective. I saw it during conflict with a mirror personality type to mine. Absolutely. That is what happens. Miles says, I liked reading Karen Armstrong, then a pastor convinced me otherwise because she is not It's All About Jesus. Now I am back to liking her again. Yeah, boy. Linda says, this is live now. Hello, Skip. I've been watching your videos for a couple of weeks, and I'm a scholar of Jung and many others myself. You're a very interesting character. Greetings from Sweden. I'm glad to find other Jungian scholars who are willing to talk with me. That's not always the case. And Miles recommends that Yahweh join the advanced reading group. And he says, really, are there things somewhere that aren't here? Yes, there are. We have an advanced reading group, which we do on Zoom every Monday at 1:30 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time to support our European friends. And because the timing is still in the evening in Europe, and we do have a number of European members of that group, so you would be welcome in order to join. The topic of the advanced reading group right now is ion researches into the phenomenology of the self. We're approaching the end of ion, and but all of the seminars that we've held are in another Dropbox of mine, and I will add you to the list if you meet our minimal criteria. And so you can send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will be happy to add you. There's some information on that below this video. And also the next topic that we're going to take up in the advanced reading group, all of the seminars on ion are still online and will stay online. And the next topic we're going to discuss is psychology and alchemy, I think, by agreement with among the advanced group. So that's my current thinking, but we'll see. And Yahweh says, is it like exclusive? And I would say, well, it's not exclusive, really exclusive, but it does require a little bit of commitment on your side. And so then Yahweh says, but I am also more of a binge watcher. I love Carl Jung, and I just think Skip presents it very well, so I listen to him from time to time, but not too much. It prouds me that a Swede like me, and I feel like there are no philosophers or depth psychologists left here in Sweden, and there probably are, but I'd like to find them. Well, I think there are depth psychologists in Sweden. I can't identify them myself, but a little research on the internet would find them, I suppose. Or you can contact the Jung Institute in Zurich, who would probably be able to put you in touch with them. They're everywhere, but they are very focused, and the reason I made my snide comment is they are very focused on individual psycho or mental health, individual mental health. My interest is more in societal mental health, which was at least 50% of what Dr. Jung was working on throughout his career. But unfortunately, that has been slipped under the rug because the Jungian community doesn't want to admit the religious aspects of what Dr. Jung's later oeuvre has to say. Miles says, yes, advanced reading group is Wednesday. Did I misspeak earlier? Yes, it's Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. I said Monday. Okay. Monday is the general group, which you can find here at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern U.S. time, whether it's standard or daylight. And we're doing the 107th session tonight on the Devil's Trick, among other things. But the advanced group is Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern U.S. time. Skip, about the whole confusion in Western society, what are your thoughts? I've been thinking about it for several years, trying to find some peace of mind. Well, this is going to be the topic for tonight, too, because we have to get our minds around what's going on, and we're all suffering from the devil's trick. And I think it might be useful to understand that. But fundamentally, I'll just give you a quick précis on it because I know it's unlikely for you to watch tonight at 4 a.m. your time. The Dr. Ann Ulanoff wrote a couple of books. Do I have them here? Yes, I do. Okay. One is The Wisdom of the Psyche, and the other one is The Living God and Our Living Psyche, what Christians can learn from Carl Jung. And in the first book, she mentions the devil's trick, and she says that Dr. Jung fell for the devil's trick. And now that I understand what she's talking about, I agree with her. And the devil's trick is, let's take any topic, and one that's current is the topic of homosexuality. And so the devil's trick is to get us to talk about the pros and cons of homosexuality rather than talk about how do you maintain the relationship in your family if one of your children comes out as a homosexual. And so if you fall for the devil's trick, you allow the dispute to destroy your family. And if you understand that you have to have relationship, then you can leave aside the questions and focus on the family relationship, which is the important thing. And you know, I have this in my own family, where at least one of my daughters isn't of the same political persuasion as I am, and that's pretty. It is a potentially big issue, except that I told her and my son-in-law years ago that we should leave aside these political issues. And this goes to the old saw that in polite company you shouldn't discuss politics and religion. And the significance is, you know, if you're invited to a social group, the idea is to be in the social group. And if you fall for the devil's trick and discuss those issues in polite society, you're going to be outcast very soon. And so, but we'll talk about that more this evening. That's a little précis on it for today. Let's see. Yahweh says about the whole SJW, white privilege, white guilt, and transgender movements and Antifa and so on, the endless madness. Sorry to bother you, but I'm starved of talking about important matters to people who actually care, much like the path of the fool from the Tarot, in pretty much alone and at least feel like it. Well, we're all alone, and I think you should look at paragraph 149 of Civilization in Transition, which is volume 10 of the collected works. You can find that in the Dropbox for the general group. If you're not a member of our Dropbox for the general group, which is free, you can send an email to skip.conover@gmail.com and I will add you, and then you can read that paragraph. So Martin says, many factors in the SJW, I think. I know certain personalities will have a proclivity, and why I feel there is manipulation currently in society. I think that the core there perhaps is also a mentality. that is guilt-based. I agree with you entirely on that, and this is how we are manipulated as people. And so, you know, the whole debate that goes on cable television is sterile, because nobody's going to change their mind on these big issues. And what we have to be discussing and should be discussing is how we create a United States of America, not a state divided into little chops, let's say, that can be eaten separately. And you know, we saw just how it works when Donald Trump was running for president, and he had that entire clown car of other candidates on the stage with him, and he just went through and he chopped them up, and each one he gave a name and so on, which is classic psychotic behavior, and they fell for it. And so the result was that he divided and conquered them until they couldn't cope, and now they don't have a backbone anymore. And so we'll see whether the GOP in the United States develops a backbone as things get worse and worse for the president. Yahweh says, man, he explains it so well and is such a gentle soul. I'm baffled. I don't know who you're talking about there, but anyway, we're all alone, but I don't feel alone when I talk to people like you, when you are referring me to the Jungian societies around Europe, like people who are interested and care about themselves. Well, what I've found is that the Jung societies are very useful for the golly gee crowd. I mean, it's very easy to read a little bit of Jung and say, wow, that was amazing, and not really get into what it means for you. You get a little insight, and then you don't get deeper. And so what happens is these Jung societies end up being intake operations for the mental health professionals who are Jungian analysts. And I don't blame them for doing that. It's a very good marketing technique for them, but I don't think it gets you very deep into yourself to go to those things. You'll probably be exposed to some golly gee aspect of Jungian psychology and rub elbows with a bunch of Jungian analysts, and then you might think you might need analysis. Okay, fine. That's perfectly legitimate way of doing business, but it doesn't address the societal issues, and that's what I'm more interested in. So Yahweh says, or the world, I know endless philosophy and self-development. It's just great. We shouldn't feel alone, or should we? Dr. Jung, in that paragraph that I mentioned here, let me get it. How much time do I have? Okay, we have a little bit of time. Now, this is the test of Skip's memory to see if I got the paragraph right, but if it's in paragraph 149, I will give it to you, because it's about aloneness. Okay, so it's actually two paragraphs, paragraphs 149 and 150 from Civilization in Transition by C.G. Jung, volume 10 of the collected works. And I actually read this, you can find it in the video called The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man, which I read a few days ago, so it's still on the front page of the YouTube channel. And so I'll just read these 2 paragraphs. To begin at once with an example of such apparent lack of caution, I must say that the man we call modern, the man who is aware of the immediate present, is by no means the average man. He is rather the man who stands upon a peak or at the very edge of the world, the abyss of the future before him, above him the heavens, and below him the whole of mankind, with a history that disappears into primeval times, into primeval mists. The modern man, or let us say again, the man of the immediate present, is rarely met with, for he must be conscious to a superlative degree. Since to be wholly of the present means to be fully conscious of one's existence as a man, it requires the most intensive and extensive consciousness with a minimum of unconsciousness. It must be clearly understood that the mere fact of living in the present does not make man modern, for in that case everyone at present alive would be so. He alone is modern who is fully conscious of the present. The man who has attained consciousness of the present is solitary. The modern man has at all times been so, for every step towards fuller consciousness removes him further from his original, purely animal participation mystique, which the herd with participation mystique with the herd from submersion in a common unconsciousness. Every step forward means tearing oneself loose from the maternal womb of unconsciousness in which the mass of man dwells. Even in a civilized community, the people who form, psychologically speaking, the lowest stratum live in a state of unconsciousness, little different from that of primitives. Those of the succeeding strata live on a level of consciousness which corresponds to the beginnings of human culture, while those of the highest stratum have a consciousness which reflects the life of the last few centuries. Only the man who is modern in our meaning of the term really lives in the present. He alone has a present-day consciousness, and he alone finds that the ways of life on those earlier levels have begun to pall upon him. The values and strivings of those past worlds no longer interest him, save from his historical standpoint. Thus he has become unhistorical in the deepest sense, and has estranged himself from the mass of men who live entirely within the bounds of tradition. Indeed, he is completely modern only when he has come to the very edge of the world, leaving behind him all that has been discarded and outgrown, and acknowledging that he stands before the nothing out of which all may grow. It goes on, but if you want to hear my reading on that, you can go to the other video, which is still quite available. But the point is that if you're truly a modern person and with a modern consciousness, and you're fully aware of how things come up, then you are alone, and it's very difficult to educate your fellow men, and so then you have to accept it and move on. So Martin says, I think this is why personality theory is very important in the learning of cognitive functions and how we need to understand the types values. In those functions, you almost get songs from the archetypal, I feel. I agree with that, Martin. You know, the point is that we have almost no research, with the exception of Dr. Jung. We have very little research on the psyche, what it is, how it works, etc. We need a lot more. And by this, I don't mean hooking electrodes up to your head and saying, okay, this part of your brain lights up when you think about sex, and this part lights up when you think about food. You know, that's kindergarten stuff. We have to get a lot deeper than that. And so think of the Hubble deep field picture. And if you don't know what that is, look it up. It's the Hubble Space Telescope's deep field image. And what happened was that astronomers decided to aim the Hubble for 11 days at a blank part of space, the part of space where they thought there were no objects. And they just opened the lens and let it receive light from very distant galaxies. And when they developed the picture, they found that there were 1,500, no, it was, and so the aspect that it was looking at is like a grain of sand held at arm's length. That's how big the aspect was. And what they found was, in that one photograph that they took, there were 1,500 galaxies in the picture. And this was a part of space that they had never even thought had anything. And they took a similar picture several years later, and in that picture they found 10,000 galaxies in the image. And that is the order of magnitude that is within the psyche and that we need to start to examine. And we've only just begun. I mean, Dr. Jung pointed the way, but he himself, in his interview at the end of his life, which you can find here on YouTube, he said, we know no thing about the psyche. And this was his perspective as a man who spent 60 years studying it. So Yahweh wants to find unity and truth. There is no unity. We are so different that the truth only emerges by the clash of ideas. I think that was one of the big surprises for me when I started to study the Red Book, is that there's so much blood in it. And the blood comes from civilizations clashing together, and finally the truth emerges. And I've talked about this at length in other videos, so I'll leave it at that for now. So Tom, let's see, I lost that. Thomas says, I would take the capital letters from social justice warrior paradigm, the word warrior as well, since all protests I've been involved in are distinctly nonviolent. In a country that has the highest incarceration rate in the world and a fairly high rate of death penalty adjudications, social justice must be a priority. Okay, I'm not going to bite at that one right now, Thomas, because I have a commitment that I have to be at a half hour, so I'm going to speed through the rest of this. Miles says, Skip, are you serving us in a noble way by sharing your creation story and Dr. Jung and friends I don't know if I'm noble or not. I'm only doing what I'm directed to do by my own self. Yeah, boy, says Skip is doing a great job. I love people like him. I've had a really traumatic life all from violent abuse to verbal abuse, which led me into psychology and philosophy because I didn't want to give up. Well, that's good. And don't give up, because that's how we grow also. And some of the most important people of history have been the most abused. And even if we take Mohandas Gandhi as an example, he spent 27 years of his life in jail. So we could say that he was badly abused, but today he's seen almost as a god in India and around the world. I mean, he deserves our respect. And he never gave up. And so, yeah, and Shakina says, I love the most creative ideas you've come across, my friend, and I will be sure not to skip them when I expand on Jung with age. I'm doing my best, but the unity is true, because I'm here feeling united with you, with your thoughts about Jung. We can unite in our feelings of what is just right. I didn't mean we are all alike. What I would say is that we're only at the beginning of understanding what the unity of humanity is ultimately going to look like. We have evolved as creatures who went off into all parts of the world. What we know about everyone around the world is that we're all essentially the same, regardless of race and regardless of country in which we developed. And there were already 100 million people in the world in 500 BC, the time of Buddha. But it took the growth of the population of the world to now nearly 8 billion, I think, to have us start bumping up against one another and then working out what the differences are. And we're only at the beginning of seeing that process, as long as we allow that process to emerge nonviolently, is an absolute necessary process. And we can adopt all the good ideas of everyone else around the world, and we can throw away all the bad ideas. And so, and I would say that every religious tradition, for example, has good ideas, and everyone has bad ideas too, and we need to, those are all bumping up against one another. Now, in terms of what that can mean for humanity in the future, I don't know, but it might save humanity, because ultimately the Earth is not going to be here. Okay, ultimately there's going to be a development of the sun in such a way that everything will be burned away. And so the question is, will humanity go out and populate the universe, or populate our corner of it in some way in the future, so that our species can even survive? And that is going to require a lot of interaction among our species. And of course, I'm talking about 4 or 5 billion year time frames here, but I'm not sure we have that much time. Now, let's see. And Miles, thank you for your comment. I appreciate it. And so now because I have, although I don't consider myself active Buddhist, I do attend a Buddhist meditation session every Monday at noontime with 5 psychologists from the state of Maryland. And so I have to discontinue this session for today. But I will be back tonight, and I hope to talk about the devil's trick tonight, among other things, and I'll be interested to hear what any of you think about that idea as well. So I will excuse myself and apologize for having to turn off this good discussion we've been having, but I have to move on, so I apologize.